My name is Kerry Ross, and I'm an associate professor of history at DePaul University. In this short lecture, I will introduce you to how ordinary Japanese people in the early 20th century made photography a part of everyday life using products produced by Japan's then thriving domestic photography industry. While the development of Japanese artistic photography in the 19th and early 20th century has received an enormous amount of scholarly and critical attention, that body of work represents a mere fraction of the photographic archive. It takes only one visit to a used bookstore in Tokyo, or to the library shelves of a major Japanese university, or to a collection of a camera-related organization, to see that the majority of photographic products and publications in the first half of the 20th century were marketed to the ordinary photographer as essential possessions of modern everyday life. In fact, photography, as it was understood by most Japanese people, was an amalgamation of different practices that were shaped as profoundly by retailing and consumption practices as by aesthetic movements and gallery exhibitions. Yet historians of photography rarely pay attention to the role of the typical middle-class consumer in photographic practice. And looking outward from photography, accounts of the history of the camera industry have routinely ignored the significant role companies such as Konishi Honten and Asanuma Shokai played as arbiters of middle-class taste. But it is the interaction between these very parties, ordinary photographers and the leading camera brands, that is critical to an understanding of the popularization of photography in the early 20th century. This necessitates us to take into account the broader field of photographic activities, including the production and sale of cameras and film, the circulation of knowledge and information about photography, and the use of those products in everyday life. Today, in order to understand the spread of photographic practices among Japan's new middle class in the early 20th century, we will look at how Japanese camera companies adopted a gendered approach to marketing photographic goods and practices in order to reach as many consumers as possible. From there, I turn to a discussion of the role of how-to literature aimed at hobby photographers, presumed by the industry to be men, in defining the boundaries of appropriate photographic practice. Finally, we will look at examples of how photographers used the products they bought to make those photographs. Hobbyists of the period usually made their pictures in the pictorial style. Pictorialism was an approach to photography that demanded not only technical skill, but also an artistic sensibility. Activities that ran parallel to middle-class male aspirations, an active role in consumption that matched their incomes, and leisure time activities that placed value on creativity as well as productivity. After watching this lecture, you will understand how camera companies marketed their products to different groups of consumers and how photographers embraced consumerism in producing their pictures. I'd like to start out today by looking at how Japanese photography companies marketed their products in advertisements. The image on the screen now shows the newly constructed Konishi Honten shop just after it opened in 1916, a veritable department store for photography, as one commentator at the time put it. Camera companies like Konishi Honten deployed overtly gendered marketing strategies to sell their products to two major groups of consumers who wanted to participate in the modern craze for photography: casual photographers and hobbyists. Advertisements for cameras addressed women and sometimes children as casual photographers, or those who only took photographs occasionally and had their films and plates developed for them by a camera shop. The hobby photographer, however, was marketed to middle-class men who saw the entire picture-making process through from beginning to end. These marketing strategies drew on specific assumptions about how women and men differently participated as consumers in leisure time activities. Companies situated women as passive consumers whose leisure time was filled with gimbura, or window shopping in Ginza, and fashion magazines, and marketed photography as fashionable and the camera as the perfect accessory for stylish women. On the other hand, the entire productive enterprise of photography was marketed to men as a serious pastime, one that coincided with middle-class masculine ambitions to acquire technical mastery and to productively use free time away from work. I'll return to these topics in a moment. For example, in this advertisement for imported photographic goods, published in 1930 in Asahi Camera, a popular monthly photographic magazine, a fashionable lady carries her camera as if it were a purse. In 1925, Konishi Honten, also known as Konishiroku, produced the first all-pressed metal camera manufactured entirely within Japan. Released in June of that year, the Pearlette was available for purchase at all Konishi Honten outlets. Marketed as the perfect camera for beginners, this Festile camera was represented in advertisements in the hands of young women and described as easy to use for anyone. In this ad, a young woman presses the shutter of her Pearlette camera, and the copy proclaims that the quality and price of the Pearlette cannot be beaten by imports. Here, the use of a female photographer as the model symbolizes to the viewer that the camera is simple to use. Simplicity and affordability. These have become the industry's lures for an emerging group of camera consumers. At 25 yen, about twice the cost of a tennis racket and quite a bit less than that of a bicycle, almost any white-collar worker or even a lowly clerk could afford the Pearlette. In another ad from 1937, Konishi Honten places the Sakura camera, a new streamlined handheld camera made of beautiful backlight, in the hands of a young boy. Simplicity and affordability. These were the buzzwords for Made in Japan. And from 1925, Japanese camera makers vigorously competed for consumers who wanted to take, but not necessarily make, photographs. In another advertisement from 1937, for the Minolta Vest and Baby Minolta cameras, a young child points her camera toward the viewer. Both ads promise that these cameras are so easy to use that even a child can do it. Other advertisements proclaimed a simple press of the button was all that was needed. And some cameras were indeed that simple, especially when the photographer left the processing of the film or plates to a photo shop or to a portrait studio to develop. As Fukuhara Shinzo, passionate photographer and critic and president of Shiseido Cosmetics Companies, put it in 1926, photography was so simple that even a 3-year-old girl could do it, just like this girl, perhaps, in the Minolta ad. A 3-year-old girl clearly represented the lowest common denominator among photographic consumers. Photography positioned as simplicity was a draw for casual photographers who were likely to pick up a camera to take photographs occasionally. By promoting photography as both fashionable and effortless, industry appealed to the young men and women who were fast becoming key consumers of and participants in the ever-expanding world of photography. Though the Kodak system of just press the button and we do the rest was not repeated by Japan's domestic camera industry at the time, shops offered developing services so that all a camera owner needed to do was to load her plates or film, take the pictures, and bring them to the camera shop for development, leaving the messy technical aspects to experts. As early as the 1910s, camera shops, both new and used, department stores, and photography studios all started to offer standardized developing services to photographers that did not have a darkroom at home, and so entrusted development of their pictures to retailers and photographic technicians. According to one scholar, by 1920, there were over 50 such establishments in Tokyo alone. Shops sold cameras, cases, and even tripods, photography's hardware, so to speak, to meet the needs of middle-class consumers, casual photographers, and those who use photography almost solely to document important moments in their families' lives or leisure time activities. But most important, shops sold film and developing services to those casual photographers whose engagement with the camera and photographic process could now be limited to taking pictures due to innovations in film and camera technologies. The major camera companies peddled their wares to a group of inexpert users who opted to take rather than make their own pictures. This comic, published in the 1930 issue of August of Asahi Camera, portrays how sometimes even the simplest of actions was too difficult to be left in the hands of a woman. A group of young, fashionable people is out for the day of fun at the beach. What better occasion to photograph? The lady with her curly locks takes out a camera. Her friends pose for the shot. She's done a fine job setting up the pose. But when she sees the photo she took, located at the bottom right of the comic, lo and behold, a mass of curly locks. We've all taken pictures of our own fingers, so we understand her embarrassment. She holds her head in disbelief. Never put a woman behind a camera. Though it may strike today's viewer as a minor detail, the fact that the final picture surprises our femme photographer indicates that she herself probably did not develop the picture. By looking at this cartoon in the broader context in which it was published, in a popular monthly photographic magazine, a not-so-subtle commentary surfaces regarding the diversification of the amateur photography market. That is, for amateurs like club and hobby photographers who were the predominant readers of Asahi Camera, the humor of the cartoon derives from the way that the female photographer is portrayed as an ignorant user. And what better way to portray a passive consumer than as a young, frivolous female who can neither make nor take a picture? So let's review. Based on what we've covered so far, the Japanese photography industry marketed their products to two different types of photographers: casual consumers and dedicated hobbyists. Simplicity was promoted to casual photographers, assumed to be women and children, while dedicated practice was marketed to middle-class men. But how was photography marketed to those hobbyists? From the 1920s, the easiest of mechanical operations, snapping a photo, became a favored subject of how-to writing, which by its very nature is meant to demystify a complicated set of practices. On the one hand, camera companies touted simplicity in advertisements for their products. But on the other hand, these same companies, along with publishers, also positioned photography as a form of complicated knowledge that could be marketed and mastered, along with cameras and film. In this slide, we see the covers of some of the most important photo magazines at the time. Photography in the 1920s and 30s had not only reached new practitioners via more affordable goods, cameras, film, lenses, cases, chemicals, and papers, but was increasingly commodified as knowledge itself, most prolifically in the form of how-to books and magazine articles targeted at middle-class men. How-to literature glorified complex technique and new technologies while establishing the legitimate technical boundaries of hobby practice. The how-to genre on photography provided technical knowledge on all aspects of photographic activities, from buying and getting to know your camera, proper storage of plates and chemicals, to outfitting a darkroom, making negatives, and printing out photographs. Part of the appeal of hobby photography was its association with modern industry and rationality, as well as advanced technological systems. Writers and publishers of how-to books like the ones you see in this slide promised to demystify the complexities of photography and thereby cultivated a sense of distinction from casual photographers, such as the women and children in the ads for the Perlette and Minolta cameras we just saw. This distinction of hobbyists from casual photographers undergirded sales to consumers in a niche market eager to participate in the consumption of modern technological products. While the industry profited from consumers who were perfectly happy to remain uneducated about the product they owned and used, camera companies and publishing houses were homing in on an equally lucrative enclave market of would-be photographic experts, hobby photographers, and amateurs. These companies marketed the equipment, chemicals, and technical know-how necessary for the entire photographic process to individual hobbyists as well as to club and art photographers, all of whom embraced the end-to-end do-it-yourself nature of dedicated practice. And by situating photography as a complex technological procedure, as anything but effortless, how-to books and articles lure the more dedicated breed of hobbyist, but perhaps not yet skillful expert, with appeals to making art with a rational attitude, hands-on production using advanced technology, and laboratory-like workspaces filled with chemicals, vials, and basins. I'd like to conclude the lecture with a discussion of how camera consumers use these products. So after having bought their cameras, what kinds of pictures did these middle-class men actually make? Most amateurs of the period worked within the aesthetic standards and vocabulary of pictorialism. This picture was made by Fujigami Hakuyo, no rank amateur, but I use the image here as an archetypical example of a photograph done in the pictorialist style. Pictorialism was an approach to photography that provided amateur photographers with an aesthetic language that matched their middle-class ideals, an active place in the world of consumerism befitting their newfound incomes, and an absorbing activity that placed value on craftsmanship. Pictorial photography, or painterly images suffused with moody, nostalgic, even romantic imagery, relied heavily upon manipulation and handwork in the image-making process, the part of photography that takes place in and around the darkroom where the image is actually made. Pictorialism allowed hobbyists not only to express themselves creatively, but more importantly, to display technical mastery over a complex apparatus. The focus on process, sometimes to the neglect of the resultant image, became a central component of the aesthetics of pictorialism. In the face of an ever-increasingly mechanized middle-class lifestyle, the creation of pictorial photographs allowed a space for handwork and a craftsman's sensibility. And because such processes typically involve the use of expensive equipment, chemicals, and papers, the camera industry actively promoted these processes in ads for their products and through contests they sponsored, not only because these techniques were fashionable, but also because they produced profit. This slide shows readers winning submissions for Asahi Kamada's monthly photo competition from April of 1928. Winning photographs were selected by the editors and published each month in the magazine. All photographers whose photos were selected received a commemorative medal, and the photos judged best by the editors also won cash prizes or products. Each photographer employed pictorialism to create moody, painterly images, many of which look more like drawings than photographs. Pictorialist techniques relied heavily on manipulation and handwork in the image-making process. Manipulation included such techniques as enlargement, painting or coloring the negative or the positive print, and the use of delicate oil transfer procedures, all of which required not only great manual dexterity, but significant restraint and responsibility on the part of the photographer as well. Though all of these techniques were widely written about and advertised, the most popular by far throughout the 1920s and early 1930s were the bromoil and bromoil transfer processes introduced by E.J. Wall in 1907. The pictorial process begins with a regularly printed enlargement rather than working on the negative, for example. The print is then chemically treated to bleach away and physically swell the image area. To restore the picture, the photographer then brushes on an oil-based ink which adheres only to the image area. This can be repeated as many times as the artist feels is necessary. Successful images require the use of the brush, a genuine artist's tool. How-to books and articles on producing art photography in the early 20th century typically featured several chapters on bromoil process, and popular photography magazines regularly published articles on the same subject throughout the 1920s and 30s. This is an amateur photograph that won Shashin Geppo's monthly competition in 1915. Called On the Road to the Gas Company. Matsuura's photo is done in the pictorialist mode using the bromoil transfer technique. What seems to me to be especially striking about the image is the contradiction between the pictorial style and the decidedly unromantic but perhaps melancholy task of walking to work to the gas company. The popularity of manipulative processes alone cannot be explained solely by the appeal of the aesthetic implications of the resulting image or the coercive strength of the camera and publishing industries. Rather, manipulative processes allowed hobbyists not only to express themselves creatively, but more importantly, to display technical mastery over a complex apparatus. Pictorialism, when properly executed, quote, offered visible evidence of the process of creation in the mark of the tool, unquote. These are John Brinkerhoff Jackson's words for the appeal of the craftsman style of furniture making aesthetic among Japan's middle-class photographers in the 20s and 30s. Jackson argues that productive hobbies like pictorialist photography and furniture making highlighted not production in the industrial sense, but rather work done by hand in which the very process of production is just as important as the finished project. In conclusion, what I've tried to demonstrate in this lecture is that by analyzing a wide variety and broad swath of unique sources, such as popular photography magazines, how-to books, advertisements, and the photos that ordinary Japanese people made, we can see that the prevailing narrative among scholars regarding the early 20th century photography as primarily the development of an albeit impressive inventory of modernist images relies upon a very small fraction of the photographic archive and does not account for the majority of photographic practices of the time. I believe that this inattention to the wider photographic archive beyond finished images housed in museum collections has created a skewed historical understanding of the social and cultural meaning of photography. Instead, photographic practice must be understood as an amalgamation of a complex relationship between middle-class consumers, profit-driven camera companies, and publishing houses. The aim of this talk has been to begin to resituate the historical discussion of photography in Japan, one that has been dominated by concerns with aesthetic representation, by focusing on marketing strategies of companies and the consumer practices of middle-class photographers in order to demonstrate the meaning of photography for ordinary Japanese people in the early 20th century.